I left my husband at 74 after he lost his construction company. You're a broke loser, I shouted. He silently nodded. A year later, his lawyer called me. Your ex-husband died yesterday. Before his death, he wanted you to know one thing. What he said made me go pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think a long marriage was proof of something. 49 years with Donald Collins. That had to mean we knew each other. That had to mean something solid, something real. Looking back now from the distance of grief and shame, I understand that I confused duration with depth. I mistook familiarity for truth. We lived in the same house in Millbrook, Ohio for 31 years, a colonial with a wraparound porch on Sycamore Drive. Donald had built it himself. Well, his crew had, back when Collins and Sons Construction was something to be proud of. In those days, Donald's name meant something in our county. He'd shake hands at the hardware store and men would nod with respect. I liked that. I won't pretend I didn't. I retired from teaching 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary in 2012. After that, my days had a pleasant, unhurried shape. Morning coffee on the porch, a book club on Tuesdays, the garden in summer. Donald still went to the office every day. That was his nature. He wasn't the kind of man who could sit still. Even at 76, he was up at 6, dressed by 6:30, out the door before I'd finished my first cup. I should tell you about Cheryl. Donald's younger sister had always been a presence in our marriage. Not always welcome, but always there. She was 68, sharp-tongued, and had worked in the company's accounting office for over 20 years. Donald trusted her completely. I never did. There was something in the way she'd look at me sometimes, a flicker of calculation behind her smile, that I could never quite name. I told Donald once, early in our marriage, that I didn't entirely trust his sister. He laughed and said I was imagining things. After that, I stopped saying it out loud, but I never stopped feeling it. The first sign came in the spring of 2022. Donald had always handled our finances. That had been our arrangement since 1974, and I'd been comfortable with it. But that March, a letter arrived from our bank while Donald was at the office. I wasn't in the habit of opening his mail. I set it on his desk and forgot about it. That evening, he came home and went straight to his study without saying hello. The door closed. I heard him on the phone, his voice low and tight in a way I hadn't heard before. I asked him about it at dinner. He said it was nothing, a vendor dispute. I believed him. The second sign came in May. Our neighbors, the Pattersons, mentioned casually that they'd heard Collins and Sons had lost the Ridgemont School contract, a major municipal job Donald had been counting on. I hadn't known he was counting on anything. When I asked Donald, he said the Pattersons were gossips and changed the subject. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. I had no reason not to believe him, but I began to notice smaller things. The way he paused before answering simple questions. The way he stopped mentioning specific projects at dinner, where once he'd talked about work constantly. The way Cheryl had started calling the house in the evenings, something she'd never done before. And how Donald would take those calls in the hallway, standing with his back to me. By August, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what or how bad. Then came September, and I found out along with everyone else. The news wasn't delivered to me privately or gently. I read it in the local paper, a small item on page 4 of the Millbrook Gazette. Collins and Sons Construction had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Debts exceeding $2.3 million. Assets insufficient to cover obligations. The company, founded in 1981, was to be liquidated. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper in my hands for a long time. When Donald came home that evening, I was still sitting there. He walked in, saw my face, and stopped in the doorway. He looked old. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. I don't know exactly what I had expected from myself in that moment. Compassion, perhaps. Patience. 49 years should have built something capable of surviving a crisis. But what came out of me wasn't compassion. It was fear dressed up as rage, and it landed on him like a blow. "You're a ruined failure, Donald," I heard myself say. My voice was louder than I'd intended. It filled the kitchen. A ruined, broken failure. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply looked at me with those pale gray eyes of his, and he nodded once, slowly, quietly, as if I had confirmed something he already believed about himself. That nod. I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand that nod. I left the following week. I want to be precise about that because it matters. Not to excuse myself, but to be honest. I did not leave in a moment of passion. I had 7 days after that scene in the kitchen. 7 days in which Donald and I moved around each other like strangers in a waiting room, and I chose to leave. That distinction has kept me awake more nights than I can count. I went to stay with my daughter, Carol, in Columbus. She was 51, divorced, with a guest room, and the particular wariness of a woman who had watched her parents' marriage from the inside for decades. She didn't say, "I told you so." She made up the bed with clean sheets and put a glass of water on the nightstand, and didn't ask me anything that first night. For that, I will always be grateful to her. But in the morning, she asked. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much. The bankruptcy. The letter from the bank I'd never opened. The phone calls with Cheryl. The Ridgemont contract. The silence that had expanded between Donald and me over months until it had become the primary atmosphere of our house. "Do you know what you actually lost?" Carol asked. She wasn't being cruel. She's an accountant. She thinks in terms of what can be quantified. I didn't know. That was the humiliating truth. I had been married to this man for 49 years, and I didn't know what we owned, what we owed, or what, if anything, remained. We spent that afternoon going through what I had brought with me. Bank statements I'd thought to grab from the filing cabinet, the deed to the house, Donald's last 2 tax returns, which I had signed without reading. Carol sat across from me at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and went through everything methodically. The house had a $180,000 home equity line of credit on it. I hadn't known. Our joint savings account held $14,200. There were 2 credit cards in both our names with a combined balance of $23,000. I was 74 years old, and I had $14,200 and a house I might lose. The fear I felt then was different from the fear I'd felt in the kitchen. That had been a hot, sudden thing. This was cold and slow, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. But fear, I have learned, can do 2 things to a person. It can paralyze, or it can clarify. Somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday of that first week in Carol's guest room, something shifted in me. I stopped lying in the dark cataloging disasters and started asking a different question. Not what happened to us, but how did it happen? Not why didn't Donald tell me, but what exactly didn't he tell me, and why? Because there was something that didn't add up. I had been a teacher for 38 years. I understood institutional failure, budget shortfalls, administrative incompetence, decisions made badly over time. But Collins and Sons had been profitable for decades. Donald was not a reckless man. He was methodical, careful, almost excessively cautious. He didn't gamble. He didn't speculate. He didn't make impulsive decisions. A company like his didn't simply collapse, not without help. And then I thought of Cheryl. The evening phone calls, the 20 years in the accounting office, the way she'd looked at me across Donald's hospital bed when he'd had his hip replaced 3 years ago. A look I'd dismissed at the time as exhaustion, but which now, with this new cold clarity, I reread differently. My first plan was simple and perhaps naive, but it was mine. I was going to find out what had really happened to Collins and Sons Construction. I was going to get copies of every financial document I was legally entitled to as Donald's wife. I was going to find out who had made which decisions and when, and if what I suspected, still only a shadow of a suspicion, turned out to be true, I was going to do something about it. I called a lawyer on Thursday morning, not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A general practice attorney named Ruth Vasquez, whom Carol knew through work and trusted. I made an appointment for the following Monday. Then I called my friend Eleanor, who had worked for the county court clerk's office for 22 years before retiring, and I asked her to have coffee with me. I told her I needed to understand what public records I could access related to a business bankruptcy filing. Eleanor didn't ask why. She just said, "Tuesday at 10, bring a notebook." I brought two. Ruth Vasquez's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a directness I found immediately reassuring. She didn't treat me like a confused elderly woman. She treated me like a client. I laid out what I knew. She listened without interrupting, made notes, and then asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Was I still legally married? Yes, I had left the house, but we had filed nothing. Was my name on the business? No. Collins and Sons had always been solely in Donald's name, though I had occasionally signed documents over the years as a witness or guarantor. Did I know the name of the bankruptcy trustee? I did not, but Eleanor had told me how to find it. Ruth explained what Chapter 7 meant in practical terms. The bankruptcy trustee would be liquidating all business assets. As Donald's spouse, I had certain rights regarding marital assets, including the house, which was jointly owned. But those rights would need to be actively asserted. She recommended I not finalize any separation agreement until the bankruptcy proceedings were further along. She also recommended I request, as Donald's legal spouse, copies of the bankruptcy filing documents. There's something else, I said. I told her about Cheryl, about the phone calls, about the accounting office, about the sense I couldn't shake that this hadn't been simply a business failure. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if there was any financial misconduct by an employee, embezzlement, fraud, falsification of records, the bankruptcy trustee would want to know, and so would the IRS. She gave me the trustee's name, a man named Gerald Park, appointed by the federal bankruptcy court. She advised me to contact him directly and request the full schedule of assets and liabilities as filed. I did that the next morning from Carol's kitchen table. Eleanor, true to her word, met me on Tuesday with a folder of printed information about public records access. Business bankruptcy filings in Ohio are federal court records, available through the federal court's online database. Eleanor walked me through it slowly, step by step, until I could navigate it myself. I am not a woman who fears technology, but I had never used a federal court database before. By the end of that session, I had printed 47 pages of documents. I took them home and read every word. The debt structure was strange. I saw it even as a layperson. There were 3 large vendor accounts, totaling nearly $900,000, that had been paid out in lump sums over the previous 18 months to companies I didn't recognize. The names were generic: Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, Great Lakes Building Resources, Inc., Consolidated Project Management Group. I wrote them all down. I called Eleanor that evening. Can you find out if those companies are real? I asked. Registered with the state, I mean. Active businesses. I can look them up in the Ohio Secretary of State's database, she said. That's public. She called me back the following morning. 2 of the 3 companies had been registered within the previous 2 years. Both had the same registered agent, a name neither of us recognized. The third company, Consolidated Project Management Group, had been dissolved just 4 months ago. All three had the same address, a UPS store in a strip mall in Westerville. I sat with that information for a long time. Shell companies. Money paid out to shell companies from Collins and Sons over 18 months, totaling nearly $900,000. And the person who had managed the company's accounting for 20 years was Cheryl Collins. I hadn't wanted to believe it, even as I'd suspected it. There's a difference between suspecting something terrible and having it confirmed in black and white on a printed page. My hands were steady as I held the papers, but something inside me had gone very quiet and very cold. It was Carol who said what I hadn't yet said aloud. "Mom," she said, standing in the doorway of the guest room, looking at the papers spread across the bed. "Did Cheryl steal from the company?" "I think she stole nearly $1 million, I said. "And I think your father knew. And I think he didn't tell me because he was trying to protect her, or protect me from it, or both. And I think that silence cost him everything." That was the moment I understood that I hadn't left a failed man. I had left a man who had been betrayed, and then betrayed again by my cruelty in the worst moment of his life. The point of no return, they call it. I had passed mine. There was no undoing what I'd said in that kitchen. But there might be something I could still do. Ruth had advised me to bring the documents to her before doing anything else. I did that on Wednesday afternoon. Drove the 40 minutes to her office myself, with the printed pages in a manila folder on the passenger seat and Eleanor's notes folded inside. Ruth read everything carefully, then made copies. "This is enough to refer to the trustee," she said. "Gerald Park has an obligation to investigate any indication of pre-bankruptcy fraud. If these companies are shells and the transfers were fraudulent, that money could potentially be recovered for the creditors. And depending on what's found, there could be criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office." "What about Donald?" I asked. Ruth was careful. "If he knew about the transfers and authorized them without understanding they were fraudulent, he may be a victim. If he participated knowingly—" She paused. "That's for the investigation to determine." I knew Donald. He had authorized those payments because his sister had told him to, had presented him with paperwork he trusted her to have verified. He was methodical, not forensic. He would not have checked whether Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, was a real company. Why would he? Cheryl was family. I authorized Ruth to contact Gerald Park's office. She sent the referral that afternoon. I had not anticipated how quickly Cheryl would find out. I don't know to this day how she learned. Whether someone in the trustee's office was less than discreet, or whether she had contacts who kept watch, or whether she simply knew with the instinct of someone who has been waiting for consequence to arrive. But 2 days later, on a Friday morning, my cell phone rang with a number I recognized. I had not heard from Cheryl since before I left Donald. I let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. Then she called Carol's landline. Carol came to the guest room doorway. "It's Donald's sister," she said. Her voice was flat. I took the phone. "Margaret." Cheryl's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. A high, thin tension, like a wire pulled too tight. "I think we need to talk, in person." "I don't think we do," I said. "You have made a very serious mistake," she said. "What you've handed to that trustee, those are internal business documents. You don't understand what you're looking at. You're going to cause enormous damage to this family based on a misunderstanding." "Then the trustee will find that out," I said. A pause. "Margaret, think very carefully. You are 74 years old. You are in the middle of a bankruptcy that affects your home. You don't have resources for a prolonged legal fight. And if you persist in making false accusations against me, I will be forced to pursue defamation." There it was, the threat, clean and direct. I had expected fear. I felt something closer to confirmation. Innocent people don't threaten defamation suits in response to financial records. Cheryl, I said, I didn't make any accusations. I sent documents to a court-appointed trustee, that's all. If there's nothing to find, there's nothing to worry about. She hung up. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed for a few minutes, then called Ruth and told her about the call. Ruth noted it and said I should document the time, date, and content. She said if Cheryl contacted me again in a threatening manner, it could be relevant. Then something unexpected happened. I cried, not from fear, or not only from fear, from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of the past weeks, from the image of Donald nodding in the kitchen doorway, from the knowledge that somewhere across town, my husband of 49 years was alone in our house on Sycamore Drive, while his sister had picked through his life's work like a crow. I took 4 days. Carol didn't push. I slept. I sat on her back porch in the October air and watched the leaves come down. I called my friend Barbara in Millbrook, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. Her grandchildren, a television show, the price of groceries. Normal things. I needed the texture of normal things. On the 5th day, I woke up at 6, made coffee, and sat down at Carol's kitchen table. I was ready to continue. The attempt at seduction, for that is what it was dressed in the language of family concern, came through an intermediary. Donald's nephew, Brian, Cheryl's son, appeared at Carol's door on a Tuesday evening. He was 43, good-looking in an effortful way, and he had always treated me with the careful deference men use toward elderly relatives they consider irrelevant. He held a casserole dish covered in foil and wore an expression of practiced sorrow. "Aunt Peggy," he said, "Mom wanted to make sure you were eating." Carol stood behind me in the doorway. I could feel her stillness. "That's thoughtful," I said. I did not move aside to let him in. Brian shifted. "She's very worried about you, about all of this. She thinks, and I think, that this situation has gotten out of hand. That maybe there are things you don't fully understand about how the company worked, about the pressures Dad, Uncle Don, was under." He stumbled on the names, which told me he'd rehearsed this and was losing his footing. "Brian," I said, "I appreciate you coming. Please tell your mother I'm fine." "The thing is," he said, lowering his voice, "if this goes further, the trustee, the investigation, it could get very complicated, for you too. You signed some documents over the years, as a co-signatory. Your name is on things." He let that sit for a moment. "Mom just wants to make sure you don't end up caught in something that wasn't your doing." There it was, softer than the phone call, but carrying the same blade. Your name is on things. An implication, not quite a threat. An invitation to be afraid. I looked at him for a moment. He had Cheryl's eyes, quick, assessing, always calculating the distance between what was said and what was meant. "Good night, Brian," I said. I closed the door. Carol exhaled behind me. "That was a threat." "Yes," I said, "a polite one." I called Ruth the next morning and told her. She confirmed that as Donald's spouse, I had occasionally witnessed or co-signed routine business documents, but that a co-signatory on standard vendor contracts carried no meaningful liability for fraud committed by an accounting officer. She said she'd document Brian's visit and the implied warning. "They're scared," Ruth said. "I know," I said. And I felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't fear or grief. Something steadier. Call it clarity. But I knew I couldn't sustain this alone on clarity alone. I needed people around me who understood not just the legal mechanics, but the human weight of what I was carrying. I called Eleanor. I told her everything. The shell companies, Cheryl's call, Brian's visit, the casserole I'd left on Carol's counter. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need to talk to Janet Myers." Janet Myers was a woman Eleanor had known for years. A retired social worker, 70 years old, who had spent decades helping older women navigate exactly the kind of terrain I was standing on. Financial abuse, family coercion, the particular cruelty of people who target those they think won't fight back. I met Janet the following Thursday at a coffee shop on the east side of Columbus. She was a compact woman with cropped silver hair and a quality of attention that reminded me of the best teachers I'd known. Not busy, not performing interest, but genuinely present. I talked for an hour. She listened, asked precise questions, and then said something I needed to hear. "What you're describing is a pattern," she said. "Cheryl didn't steal from a business. She stole from a family. She used her position of trust, and she counted on Donald's loyalty to her to keep it buried, and she counted on your trust in Donald to keep you from looking too closely. And now she's counting on your fear of conflict, and your age, and your isolation to keep you quiet." She paused. "How's that working out for her?" I almost smiled. Janet connected me with a support group that met weekly in Columbus. Women, mostly older, navigating elder financial abuse and family legal disputes. I went the following Monday. I didn't say much. I listened. But for the first time since I'd sat at Donald's kitchen table with a newspaper in my hands, I didn't feel alone. That mattered more than I had words for. Cheryl was watching. I had no doubt of that. Brian's visit had been reconnaissance as much as anything else. They were waiting to see if the casserole and the quiet threat had been enough. They had not been enough. She came herself on a Saturday morning in November. I had returned to Millbrook by then. Not to the house on Sycamore Drive, but to Barbara's spare room on the other side of town. Barbara was 71, widowed, a practical woman who made good coffee and asked few unnecessary questions. Being back in Millbrook felt strange, like returning to the scene of something I hadn't yet finished understanding. I drove past Sycamore Drive once, without meaning to. Took a wrong turn in the familiar streets of my own town, which told me something about the state I was in. The Colonial looked the same from the outside. The porch swing where I'd drunk coffee for 30 years. The maple in the front yard that Donald had planted the year Carol was born. I drove past without stopping. Cheryl knocked at Barbara's door at 10 in the morning. She was dressed carefully, a dark coat, low heels, her gray hair set. She carried nothing. No casserole, no intermediary. She had come to do this herself. Barbara opened the door, looked at her, and looked at me across the living room. I nodded. Barbara stepped back and let her in, but did not leave the room. She sat down in her armchair by the window with a cup of coffee and a paperback, and she read, or appeared to read, while Cheryl and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "I'm not here to argue," Cheryl said. Her voice was the voice she used when she wanted to appear reasonable, measured, almost warm. I had heard it at holiday tables for 49 years. "I'm here because I'm genuinely worried about you, Margaret. About what this is doing to you. You've been through an enormous shock. Donald's business failing, leaving your home. That's traumatic for anyone. And sometimes when we're in that state, we look for someone to blame." "I'm not looking for someone to blame," I said. "I sent financial documents to a court trustee." "Those documents were incomplete," she said. "You saw numbers without context, without understanding how construction accounting works, the advance payments, the subcontractor structures. Those companies you flagged, they were legitimate vendors. Small, yes. Unconventional in their setup, but legitimate." "The UPS store address," I said. A flicker crossed her face. So brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching so carefully. "A registered agent address. That's completely standard for small LLCs. All three of them, the same registered agent. Registered within the past 2 years. Paid nearly $1 million. "Margaret." She leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry about what happened with the company. But what you're doing, bringing outside investigators into a family matter, is going to hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. Donald's name, his legacy, what his sons remember about him." She paused. Then, softer. "You spent 49 years building something together. Don't let bitterness erase that. Don't let this be how people remember the Collins family. She placed her hand briefly on the table between us, not touching mine, but close. An offer, performed. There's still time to step back. No one would blame you. You've been through enough. I recognized the move for what it was, an appeal to the woman she believed I still was, the one who deferred, who preserved, who smoothed things over to keep the peace. She had known me for 49 years. She thought she knew what I would do. What Carol will think, she continued, when all of this is examined and people start asking what you knew and when. There was the real threat, stated finally without a veil. Carol, your daughter, her name. She was expanding the blast radius, making it personal, making it about protecting my child. My hands were flat on the table. I felt them as if from a slight distance. Cheryl, I said, I've been married to your brother for 49 years. I know what family loyalty means to him. I understand why he protected you. I think he protected you right up until he couldn't anymore, and I think that cost him more than the company. I paused. But I am not Donald. I don't have his particular kind of loyalty. And Carol is an accountant. She's seen the same documents I have. So that particular argument won't work on either of us. The warmth went out of Cheryl's face. You are making a very serious mistake, she said. Her voice had changed. Flatter now, the civility stripped back. I have resources you don't have. I have documentation that can complicate your position considerably. If you think this ends with you being the wronged party, you are badly mistaken. Then we'll let the trustees sort it out, I said. She stood, buttoned her coat, looked at me for a moment with something I can only describe as contempt. Not for me specifically, I thought, but for the situation, for the fact that it had come to this, for the inconvenient stubbornness of a 74-year-old woman who should, by any reasonable calculation, have been easier to manage than this. She left without saying goodbye to Barbara. Barbara set down her paperback. Well, she said. Yes, I said. I went to the guest room and sat on the bed. My heart was beating faster than usual. I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't afraid. I was. Cheryl was not an unintelligent woman, and she'd had months to prepare while I'd had weeks. She had said she had documentation that could complicate my position. I didn't know what that meant, and not knowing was the most frightening part. I thought about Donald, about the fact that he had sat across from Cheryl in a room somewhere in July, and believed her when she told him the money could be returned quietly. He had been afraid too, afraid of what the truth would cost her, cost the family, cost the idea of what the Collins name meant in this town. Fear had made him choose silence. I had seen where that led. My fear was telling me the same things his fear had told him. Step back, stay quiet, let it go. And I understood, sitting on that bed in Barbara's guest room with November light coming through the curtain, that this was exactly the moment that mattered. Not the dramatic ones, not the scene in the kitchen, not the grocery store confrontation yet to come. This quiet, private moment. This choice. I called Ruth on Monday morning and reported the visit in full. Good, Ruth said. Keep documenting everything. She said she has documentation that could complicate my position, I said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Let her play that card. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. But right now, the trustees' investigation is moving forward. Gerald Park's office has been in contact with the Ohio Secretary of State and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I repeated that back. The FBI. This is federal bankruptcy fraud, Margaret. If those transfers were what they look like, it's not just a civil matter. I hung up the phone, sat in the quiet of Barbara's kitchen. Outside, November rain moved across the window. I was afraid, and I was not going to stop. The call from Gerald Park's office came on a Tuesday in early December, 13 weeks after I had first sent those documents to Ruth. Gerald Park himself was on the line. Not an assistant, not a paralegal. He asked if I could come to his office the following day. He said the trustee's investigation had reached a significant point, and he wanted to discuss findings with me in person as a relevant party. I drove to Columbus alone. Ruth met me in the lobby of Park's building. We rode the elevator up without speaking. She had told me that morning to expect significant findings. She had not told me exactly what, because she said she wanted me to hear it in the room, in the proper context, rather than alone in a car on the highway. In the conference room, there were 4 people: Gerald Park, a woman from his staff, a man named Agent David Cho from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I sat down and looked at the papers in front of me and kept my hands still. What they had found was this: Midwest Supply Partners, LLC, Great Lakes Building Resources, Inc., and Consolidated Project Management Group had all been registered by a single attorney acting as nominee. That attorney had subsequently been contacted by federal investigators and had provided his client's name under a cooperation agreement. The client was Cheryl Collins. Over the course of 22 months, Cheryl had authorized transfers from Collins & Sons' operating account to her 3 shell companies, totaling $923,000. She had structured the payments to fall below federal reporting thresholds where possible. She had created and filed false invoices within the company's accounting system to document services that had never been rendered. She had done this methodically over nearly 2 years while her brother's company bled to death. I want to be precise about what that means in human terms. Donald had spent 41 years building Collins & Sons. He had started with 2 employees and a borrowed truck. He had built the warehouse on Route 40, the elementary school annex in Grover Township, the assisted living complex outside Millbrook that my friend Eleanor's mother had lived in for her last 3 years. He had built things that still stood, and his sister had sat in the accounting office and quietly dismantled all of it, payment by payment, invoice by invoice, across 22 months. The deficits she had created had made it impossible for Collins & Sons to meet payroll obligations during a difficult contract period, had torpedoed the company's credit rating, and had directly caused the bankruptcy. Donald had known something was wrong in the accounts in the final months. The documents showed he had confronted Cheryl in July. She had told him the irregularities were due to vendor payment errors that she was correcting. He had believed her. He had believed her right up until the filing. Of course he had. She was his sister. He had known her for 76 years. Some loyalties are longer than judgment. I sat in that conference room and listened to all of this with my hands flat on the table, and I did not cry. I had done my crying in October. What I felt now was something quieter and colder and more permanent. The specific grief of understanding something completely after it is too late to act on it differently. Agent Cho said that Cheryl would be receiving a federal criminal referral within the week. The charges would likely include wire fraud, bank fraud, and bankruptcy fraud, each carrying significant federal penalties. He thanked me for bringing the documents forward. I said, "Donald should have been the one to sit here." No one said anything for a moment. Then Gerald Park said quietly, "Yes, he should have." Ruth touched my arm briefly as we left the building. She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. I didn't plan to see Cheryl again, but she came to me. I had stopped at the grocery store in Millbrook on my way back from Columbus. A mechanical errand, something to do with my hands. The store was quiet at that hour. A Thursday afternoon, mostly retired people and mothers with strollers. The bread aisle smelled of something warm from the bakery at the back. I was looking at loaves without really seeing them when I heard footsteps and looked up. She must have seen my car in the parking lot. She walked toward me, and I did not move. There was nowhere to go, and more importantly, I had no desire to go anywhere. We had reached the end of something. Both of us knew it. Her composure, which she had maintained across every phone call and visit, had altered. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup hadn't fully covered. She had the look of a person who had not been sleeping. The careful coat, the set hair, all still present, but wearing thin, like a costume that no longer quite fit. "They came to my house," she said. Her voice was low. "Federal agents. Margaret, you don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done," I said. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I submitted financial documents to a bankruptcy trustee. The federal investigation that followed was their decision, not mine." "You destroyed this family." Her voice cracked, not with grief, I thought, with fury at consequence, the fury of someone who had built something carefully and watched it fall. 49 years, and you couldn't leave it alone. You couldn't just let it. "Let it what?" I said. "Let it be buried? Let Donald be remembered as the man who ran his company into the ground through his own incompetence? Let $923,000 disappear and the people who were owed money get nothing? Let you—" I stopped, breathed. "Donald protected you until the end. He had that choice. I don't make the same one." She stared at me. I had the impression she was looking still for some opening, some softness, some flicker of the woman she'd counted on. An elderly schoolteacher. A wife who signed documents without reading them. A woman who had said ruined failure in a kitchen and then left. That woman, she had calculated, could be managed. She had miscalculated. The thing I remember most about that moment is how still I was. Not cold. I've been told I was cold, and I don't think that's accurate. I was clear. After months of confusion and fear and grief, I was simply and absolutely clear. Cheryl turned and walked away. Her heels on the linoleum, the fluorescent light of the bread aisle, the ordinary world continuing around us. An elderly woman in a grocery store, nobody watching. Nobody who would have guessed. I put a loaf of bread in my basket and went to the checkout. Then came the call from Donald's attorney. I had not spoken to Donald since I left. I had thought about calling him, had picked up the phone twice in November, set it down twice. I told myself I was waiting until the legal situation was clearer. The truth was more complicated, and I knew it, even as I told myself otherwise. I didn't know how to begin a conversation that started with, "I called you a ruined failure, and you nodded, and I have been unable to forget that nod." Some sentences don't have a good approach. You can only walk straight into them or not at all, and I had not yet found the courage to walk straight in. His attorney, a man named Philip Okafor, who had handled Donald's personal estate separately from the business, called me on a Wednesday morning in February. He said Donald Collins had passed away the previous day at Millbrook General Hospital. Cardiac arrest. He had been admitted 4 days prior. He said Donald had asked him to contact me. I drove to Philip Okafor's office on Friday. I don't remember the drive. I remember sitting in the parking lot for a while before going in. Long enough that a woman walking past glanced at me with brief concern. I nodded at her, and she moved on. I sat another few minutes, watching the ordinary street, a UPS truck double parked, a dog being walked by a teenager. Then I went inside. Philip was a careful man in his 60s, silver-haired, deliberate in his speech in a way that I found steadying. He offered condolences, which I received quietly. Then he said, "Your husband left specific instructions for this conversation. He knew in his last weeks what had been found by the federal investigation. He knew about your role in initiating the inquiry." A pause. "He wanted you to know that he was grateful." I said nothing. Philip continued. "He also wanted you to know that he had known about Cheryl's theft for approximately 4 months before the bankruptcy filing. He had confronted her in July, as you may have learned. She told him the money could be returned quietly. over time, without involving authorities. He, Philip paused again, chose his words carefully, the way men do when they're trying to be accurate about something painful. He agreed to try, not to protect himself. He believed that involving the law would destroy her. She had grandchildren. He had known her for 68 years. He couldn't do it. I thought about that for a moment, about the particular texture of Donald's loyalty, how deep it ran, how it had cost him, how it had ultimately been turned against him by the person who understood it best. He also wanted you to know, Philip said, that he had restructured his personal assets prior to the bankruptcy in a way that preserved certain accounts that were solely in his name, accounts the business bankruptcy could not reach. He did this with legal guidance before the filing, when he understood what was happening. He has left those accounts to you, and to Carol, and his sons David and Michael from his first marriage. Philip slid a document across the desk. The total value is approximately $340,000. I looked at the number for a long time. He protected you, I said finally, even then. He said to tell you. Philip looked at a handwritten note on his legal pad. He said, she was right to be angry. She just didn't know what she was angry at. I pressed my hand flat on the desk and breathed. It was the most Donald sentence I had ever heard. Precise, generous, slightly deflecting. The sentence of a man who could absorb blame with more grace than he'd ever asked for credit. I had spent 49 years with him and hadn't fully seen that about him, and now I was sitting in a lawyer's office, seeing it for the first time with nowhere left to take it. How does a person carry that? Carefully, I suppose. One day at a time. The way you carry most things that can't be put down. Cheryl Collins was indicted by a federal grand jury in March on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of bank fraud, and 1 count of bankruptcy fraud. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial was scheduled for the following autumn. She did not come to Donald's funeral. Her son Brian attended briefly and stood in the back and did not approach me. He looked like a man who had recently realized something about himself and wasn't handling it well. I didn't speak to him. There was nothing useful to say. The house on Sycamore Drive was included in the bankruptcy estate and was sold. My share of the equity, after the home equity line was settled, came to $47,000. Combined with the inherited accounts, I was not wealthy, but I was not destitute. I was a 74-year-old woman with resources enough to begin again. I had not expected to be beginning again at 74. But there it was. Gerald Park's office, in the final report of the bankruptcy estate, noted that the fraudulent transfers, to the extent they could be recovered from seized assets, would be distributed to creditors. Several of Collins and Sons' former employees and subcontractors received partial payments. A man named Roy Hutchins, who had worked for Donald for 18 years, called me after he received his. He said he'd always known Donald was a good man. He said the Friday kolaches. He said the time Donald had driven an hour in a snowstorm to help him get his truck out of a ditch. Small details, the real fabric of a life. I thanked him, and we talked for a long time, and I wrote some of it down afterward, because I wanted to keep it. So did a man named Terrence Webb, who had worked on Donald's crew for 11 years and had been owed 3 months' wages when the company folded. He wrote, I want you to know he was a good boss. I'm sorry for your loss. I kept both notes. I put them in the same folder as Donald's last message, the folded piece of paper from Philip Okafor's office. I never blamed her. I want her to know that. Philip had told me at the end of that meeting that this final line had been written separately from the rest. Added at the bottom of the page in handwriting slightly less steady than the lines above it, as if written later or in a different state. A thing decided upon. A thing chosen. I sat with that for a long time. In the parking lot. On the drive home. In the weeks that followed. He had been betrayed by his sister and abandoned by his wife in the worst year of his life, and his final recorded act had been to make sure I knew he didn't blame me. That is the thing I will carry longest. Not with guilt. Or not only with guilt. With something harder to name. A kind of reverence for the particular way some people move through the world, even when the world has not been kind to them. I moved to a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus in the spring. 3rd floor, south-facing, with a window over a small courtyard where someone had planted rose bushes that bloomed red in June. I had not lived alone since 1974. The first weeks were disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the silence, which I'd braced for, but the absence of accommodation. I no longer needed to account for another person's schedule, preferences, or moods. I ate dinner at 5 or at 8:30, depending on what I was doing. I rearranged the furniture 3 times in the first month because I could. Small freedoms, but they accumulated into something real. Carol came every other Sunday. We had grown closer in ways that the crisis had made possible, which is one of the strange gifts embedded in terrible things. She had always kept a certain careful distance from me, not unkind but protective of herself, in the way children of long, difficult marriages sometimes are. Now we talked plainly about Donald, about my choices, about her own marriage that had ended 8 years prior, and which I had never fully understood until she explained it to me with the directness we'd both learned that year. I went back to the support group on Monday evenings. I began to facilitate, occasionally, when Janet asked me to. I was useful there in ways I hadn't expected. Old women in difficult situations sometimes needed to hear from someone who had been through it and was still standing, still clear-eyed, still capable of laughing. I laughed more than I had expected. In the summer, I took a trip. Something I had always deferred during the marriage because Donald didn't like to fly. 2 weeks in New England with Barbara, who had also never been. Maine, Vermont. The kind of landscape that makes you feel correctly small. I ate lobster in a shack on a dock in Portland and felt, with some surprise, something close to joy. I began writing. Nothing dramatic, a journal at first, then something longer, a kind of account. I'm not sure it will ever be read by anyone. But the act of writing it down, of putting the sequence of events in order and examining each one honestly, has been its own form of resolution. Cheryl Collins went to trial in October. Her defense argued that the vendor payments had been authorized by Donald Collins himself, and that any irregularities were the result of poor documentation, not fraud. The defense presented records showing Donald's signature on several of the authorization forms. The prosecution presented the testimony of the nominee attorney, who confirmed under oath that Cheryl had retained him to establish the LLCs and had directed their management. They presented email correspondence, recovered from company servers, in which Cheryl had coordinated invoice creation with an outside contact. They presented evidence that 2 of the 3 shell company bank accounts had been accessed via a device registered to Cheryl's home address. The jury deliberated for 11 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in January. The federal judge, a woman in her late 50s who spoke in a deliberate, measured way that reminded me of Ruth, sentenced Cheryl Collins to 6 years in federal prison and ordered restitution of $923,000 to be paid from seized assets to the bankruptcy estate for distribution to creditors. She did not look at me during sentencing. I was present in the back row of the gallery, and she did not look at me once. Brian had testified for the defense, a character witness, speaking about his mother's commitment to family and her long service to the company. His testimony had not helped. He had lost his job the previous spring. He worked in financial services, and the publicity around his mother's indictment had made his position untenable. His wife had filed for divorce in August. I knew these things because small towns have long memories, and Carol kept me informed. I did not feel satisfaction about Brian's troubles. I felt something more neutral. He had made choices as his mother's instrument, and choices have consequences. That was not justice, exactly. It was just the way things tend to move. What I felt something closer to satisfaction about, quiet, private satisfaction, was the partial restitution paid to former Collins and Sons employees. Roy Hutchins sent me a note. So did a man named Terrence Webb, who had worked on Donald's crew for 11 years and had been owed 3 months' wages when the company folded. He wrote, "I want you to know he was a good boss. I'm sorry for your loss." I kept both notes. I put them in the same folder as Donald's last message, the folded piece of paper from Philip Okafor's office. I never blamed her. I want her to know that. Spring came again. The rose bushes outside my window bloomed a second time. I was 75. I had a daughter who called me regularly, a friend in Barbara, a community on Monday evenings, a journal I was slowly filling. I had the memory of a man who had, in the end, told me exactly what I needed to know. Not to exonerate me, but to release us both from something we might otherwise have carried indefinitely. That was enough. I was learning, slowly, imperfectly, genuinely, that enough is not a small thing. I have thought a lot about that moment in the kitchen. One sentence, and how much it cost. We don't always get to apologize to the people we hurt. We don't always get to know the full truth of someone else's story while they're still here to tell it. What I learned at 74 is this: cruelty spoken in fear is still cruelty. Silence carried out of love is still a kind of failure, and it is never too late to ask the right questions, even when the answers are hard. What would you have done? If this story reached something in you, I'd be glad to know. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening to the end. My late husband hid a safe in his room for 40 years. After the funeral, my children took all the inheritance. "The safe is empty," they said, but I opened it anyway. Inside was an envelope. "Open this, you'll learn the truth about our family." My hands trembled when I opened it and saw, "Good day, dear listeners." It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Eleanor Hart, and for 43 years I believed I knew everything about my husband. I believed it the way you believe in the floor beneath your feet, not because you check it every morning, but because it has never once given way. George was a quiet man, a careful man. He drank his coffee black, kept his shoes by the door, and always kissed me on the forehead before bed, even on the nights we'd argued. We had a good life in our house on Clover Ridge Road in Columbus, Ohio. A house with a porch that creaked in just the right way and a garden I'd tended for 30 years. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. George had worked as a civil engineer for the county for most of his career, and I had spent 2 decades as a school librarian before retiring. We had a routine, and in that routine I found a kind of happiness I'd never thought to question. George had 2 children from his first marriage, Diane, who was 51 when he died, and Randall, who was 48. I'd known them since they were teenagers. I had tried, in the way that stepmothers try when they know the odds are against them, to be fair, to be warm, to be present without overstepping. It had never been easy. Diane had her mother's narrow eyes, and her mother's talent for saying the polite thing while meaning the cruel one. Randall was quieter, but quieter in the way a locked room is quiet. You sense that something is happening inside, and you are not invited to know what. Still, for the sake of George, we managed. There were Thanksgivings, there were birthdays, there were grandchildren brought to the porch and set loose in the garden. It was not love, but it was family, and I respected the difference. What I did not know, what I would not let myself fully admit until it was too late, was that something had been shifting in that family for years. The first sign came 3 years before George died, when Diane began visiting more frequently. Not warmly, purposefully. She would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon, spend 20 minutes with her father in the study with the door closed, and leave without staying for dinner. I told myself it was estate planning. George was 77. His health was not perfect, and it was reasonable that his children would want to understand what would happen when he was gone. I told myself that, and I half believed it. The second sign was the safe. George had kept a fireproof safe in the corner of the study for as long as I could remember. He'd told me early in our marriage that it held his important documents, deeds, insurance papers, his first wife's death certificate, things like that. I had never felt the need to open it. I trusted him. That was the nature of what we had. But in the last year of his life, after his diagnosis, I noticed that the safe seemed to draw Diane's attention in a way that made my stomach tight. Once coming down the hallway, I heard her ask him about the combination. George had answered in a voice too low for me to catch. She had laughed, and the laugh was not the laugh of a daughter reassuring a father. It was lighter than that. Relieved? I said nothing. What would I have said? George died on a Tuesday in March in the hospital, with me holding his left hand and Randall standing by the window pretending to look at his phone. The funeral was a quiet affair. I moved through it the way you move through water, slowly, with resistance, feeling the weight of everything. I did not cry at the service. I cried at night, alone, in our bed, which suddenly had too much space in it. Diane and Randall stayed in the house for 3 days afterward, helping, as they called it, to sort things out. On the second day, while I was sitting with a neighbor in the kitchen, I heard them in the study, drawers opening, the particular sound of a dial lock clicking through numbers, then silence. That evening, Diane told me that the safe had been opened, that it held only some outdated insurance documents and George's old military discharge papers, and that she and Randall had taken them to be filed properly. "There wasn't much inside, Eleanor," she said, using my full name the way people do when they want to sound authoritative. "Nothing of real value." I nodded. I thanked her. I went upstairs. But something sat wrong in me that night. Something I could not name. I lay in the dark and I thought about the safe, about Diane's face when she'd described it as empty, about the particular flatness in her voice. I thought about 43 years of trusting a man. And then I thought, what if the floor has been giving way for longer than I knew? 2 days after the children left, I walked into the study, sat down in George's chair, and looked at the safe. It was still there, closed, and tucked into the narrow space between the safe's back edge and the wall, invisible unless you were sitting in that exact chair at that exact angle, was a small white envelope. My hands shook as I reached for it. On the front, in George's careful handwriting, "For Eleanor. Open this and you will know the truth about our family." I held it for a long time before I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, written in George's cramped, deliberate hand. The same hand that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists and the deed to our house for 40 years. I read it sitting in his chair in the quiet of the study, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds in long, pale strips across the floor. I read it once quickly, the way you read something when you are hoping you've misunderstood. Then I read it again slowly, because I had not misunderstood at all. George began by telling me he was sorry, not for the general sorrow of a man who knows he is dying, but for something specific. He had discovered, 14 months before his death, that Diane and Randall had been systematically withdrawing money from a joint investment account, an account he'd opened in all 3 of their names 15 years ago for family investment purposes, which in practice had meant that he deposited money and the children occasionally asked to borrow from it. Over the course of 7 years, he wrote, they had transferred $230,000 from that account into private accounts he hadn't known existed. They had done it gradually. A few thousand here in a slow quarter. 8,000 in a year when he'd been distracted by a minor health scare. They had banked on the fact that he reviewed those statements infrequently and that his trust in them was a blind spot wide enough to walk through. When he'd confronted them, and he had confronted them, which I had known nothing about, they had not denied it. Instead, they had told him that the money was an advance on their inheritance, that they'd assumed he wouldn't mind, that he'd always said the account would be theirs one day anyway. George, who had never been a man comfortable with conflict, had not called a lawyer. He had not called the police. He had done what men of his generation sometimes did when the wound came from their own children. He had absorbed it, quietly, and tried to decide what to do next. What he had done next was rewrite his will. The new will, he wrote, left the house on Clover Ridge Road to me outright, along with a separate savings account holding $68,000 that only he and the estate lawyer knew about. His instructions were clear. Diane and Randall were to receive nothing beyond a modest sum he'd already designated in a life insurance policy, money they couldn't touch until the proper process was followed. But George had made one catastrophic error. He had not immediately filed the new will with the probate court or left it in a lawyer's care. He had kept it in the safe, believing there was time. He was 79 years old, and he had believed, as people do, that the end was still abstract. The letter told me where the new will had been, inside the safe, in a sealed envelope marked with the attorney's name and address. And Diane and Randall had taken it. I set the letter down on the desk. Outside, a car passed on Clover Ridge Road, its tires making a soft sound on the wet spring pavement, and the ordinary noise of it made the silence inside the house feel even larger. I sat with what I had just read, and I let it settle through me. Not like water, but like something heavier, like sediment. They had stolen from their father while he was alive. They had taken the will after he died. And they had stood in this house 3 days after his funeral and told me, with Diane's careful, authoritative voice, that the safe had held nothing of real value. The anger came later. First came the fear. I was 74 years old. My name was on the deed to this house. I knew that, at least. But the investment account, the savings account George had mentioned, the proper execution of any estate, all of that was now tangled in whatever they had done. I didn't know exactly what they had filed with the probate court. I didn't know what version of the will was currently in the system. I didn't know how far they had already gone. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I sat in that chair and I was afraid in the way you are afraid when you realize the ground has been unsteady for a long time and you are only now feeling it. But here is what I also knew. I had the letter. 4 pages, in George's handwriting, describing exactly what had happened, who had done it, and where the evidence could be found. I had the name of the estate attorney, a man named Philip Greer, whose office was on Oak Street downtown. And I had the knowledge that the account records, 7 years of transfers, existed somewhere, in some bank, retrievable by someone with the right legal standing. I was not helpless. I was frightened, but I was not helpless. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a zippered pouch in my winter coat. The coat Diane never touched because she found it unfashionable. Then I walked to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the table where George and I had eaten breakfast for 30 years. What would a sensible woman do? I thought. Not a dramatic woman, not a vengeful woman, a sensible one. She would get a lawyer, not George's estate attorney. Not yet. Not until she understood what had already been filed. A different lawyer. one who was hers alone. I picked up my phone. I called my neighbor and closest friend, Barbara Weston, who had been a paralegal for 20 years before she retired. "Barbara," I said when she answered, "I need the name of a good probate attorney, and I need you not to mention it to anyone." There was a pause. Then Barbara said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." That was the first decision. And from that decision, everything else followed. Philip Greer's name was on a brass plate beside a door on Oak Street. But I didn't go to him first. Barbara arrived that evening with a notepad and the name of a woman named Catherine Marsh, a probate and estate litigation attorney who had handled a case for Barbara's cousin some years back. "She's not cheap," Barbara said, setting her bag down at my kitchen table with the comfortable efficiency of someone who knows when a situation requires practicality over sympathy. "But she's thorough, and she doesn't lose." I called Catherine Marsh's office the next morning and made an appointment for the following Thursday. In the days between, I did not sleep well, but I used the sleeplessness productively. I went through every drawer in the study. I found bank statements going back 12 years. George had been a paperman, the kind who printed and filed. I found the quarterly statements for the joint investment account. And when I sat with them, and a legal pad, tracking the withdrawals the way George's letter had described, I found them. Transfers. Modest at first, then larger. Consistent with what he'd written, almost to the dollar. I photographed every page with my phone. Then I put the originals in a manila folder and the folder in a tote bag that I kept in my bedroom closet under a folded quilt. I did not tell the children what I was doing. I did not call them. I responded to Diane's one text. A brief checking in, "Hope you're resting," with an equally brief, "I'm fine, thank you." I had learned, reading that text, something about her. She expected passivity from me. She had always expected it. She had built her plan on it. When I met with Catherine Marsh that Thursday, I brought the letter, the bank statements, and a written timeline I'd compiled from memory and from the dates in George's letter. Catherine was a trim woman in her early 50s with a quiet manner and the habit of reading documents with complete stillness, not moving, not reacting, just absorbing. She read everything I brought her. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "your first question is whether an updated will was filed with probate. Let me check that today." She checked while I waited in her conference room with a cup of coffee I was too nervous to drink. She came back 20 minutes later with a printed document and placed it on the table between us. The will that had been submitted to the Franklin County Probate Court was dated 11 years ago. It was not the revised will, it was the original. The one George had superseded, the one that left the bulk of the estate divided between Diane and Randall, with a modest spousal share for me. Someone had filed the old will. Diane or Randall, or both of them together, had gone to the probate court within days of the funeral and filed a document that George himself had invalidated. Catherine watched me read the filing date. "This was submitted 6 days after the death," she said. 6 days. While I was still sitting in this house eating casseroles brought by neighbors and trying to remember how to sleep, they had been at the courthouse. "Is that fraud?" I asked. "Suppressing a known later will and submitting a prior one," Catherine said carefully, "is, at minimum, a serious matter of civil liability. If we can establish that they had knowledge of the later will and deliberately withheld it, we are looking at something considerably more serious than a civil matter." I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but the particular steadiness that comes when the shape of a thing becomes clear. This is real, I thought. This is happening, and it is real, and there is a path through it. "What do we do first?" I asked. "We subpoena the bank records," Catherine said, "and we contact Philip Greer." Philip Greer, it turned out, remembered the revised will very well. When Catherine called him that same afternoon, I sat in her office and listened. He confirmed that he had drafted it, that George had signed it in his presence, and in the presence of 2 witnesses 14 months before the death, and that George had left the office with the original, intending to store it safely, while a copy remained in Greer's files. A copy in Greer's files. I want you to understand what that meant. They had taken the original from the safe, believing that destroying it, or simply concealing it, would erase its existence. They had not known about the copy. The copy existed. The revised will existed. And it said exactly what George had written to me that it said. That evening, driving home from Catherine's office, I stopped at a red light on Oak Street and sat there for a moment after it turned green, while the car behind me waited patiently. I was thinking about Diane's face when she'd said nothing of real value. I was thinking about Randall standing at the hospital window, pretending to look at his phone. Did they believe they had been careful enough? I thought. Did they believe I would simply accept what they told me and grieve quietly and sign whatever they put in front of me? Perhaps they did. Perhaps that was the most important mistake they made. I drove home. I made dinner. I called Barbara to tell her what I'd found. And somewhere across town, I learned later, Diane had called Randall that same evening because she had noticed something. Some small change in my behavior, some absence of the grateful, compliant tone she'd expected. "She's not returning my calls properly," she told him. "Something feels off." She was right. Something was very off. I had a lawyer, a copy of the real will, and a subpoena in process. The point of no return had passed quietly, like most important moments do, without fanfare, in an ordinary room, over a cup of coffee I never finished drinking. The subpoena for the bank records was filed on a Monday. Catherine had explained the process carefully. The court would compel the bank to produce 7 years of account activity for the joint investment account, and those records would be formally entered into the estate proceedings that she was now moving to reopen. Reopening the proceedings was the first battle. She had to petition the probate court on the basis of newly discovered evidence, specifically the existence of a later will and the copy held by Philip Greer. The petition was filed on the same Monday as the subpoena. I didn't tell the children. I didn't need to. The probate court notified all interested parties automatically, as it is legally required to do. Diane called me on a Wednesday morning. I was in the garden, kneeling by the rosebed I'd neglected since George died, trying to remember what ordinary life felt like. When I saw her name on the phone, I stood up slowly, brushed the dirt from my gloves, and answered. "Eleanor." Her voice had a quality I recognized, tight at the edges, controlled in the middle. "What is this petition? What are you doing?" "I'm contesting the estate proceedings," I said. There was a silence. Then, "On what grounds?" "Daddy left a will, Eleanor. It was filed properly. I don't know who's been talking to you or what they've been telling you, but there's a second will, Diane," I said. "Philip Greer has a copy. It was drafted 14 months before your father died." Another silence, longer this time. "That's not possible," she said. But her voice had changed. The control in the middle had gone soft. "I'd like you and Randall not to contact me directly about this anymore," I said. "You can speak with my attorney. Her name is Catherine Marsh." I gave the phone number. I said goodbye. I ended the call. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that with some surprise. They came to the house 2 days later, both of them, which told me they'd been planning the visit together. It was a Friday evening, and they arrived without calling, which they knew I found rude, which meant they wanted me off balance. Randall had his hands in his jacket pockets and wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Diane was in the mode I thought of privately as managing Eleanor. Composed, slightly sorrowful, treating me the way you treat someone who has made an embarrassing scene at a party. I let them in. I did not offer coffee. We sat in the living room, they on the sofa, me in the armchair that had been George's, which I chose deliberately. Diane began with sympathy. Grief did strange things to people, she said. It was completely understandable that I was struggling. She and Randall only wanted what was best for me, for everyone, for Dad's memory. Then she shifted. The petition, she said, was going to be painful for the whole family. It would drag things through court for months, possibly years. It would be expensive. It would require me to sit through depositions, to have my marriage examined, to face questions about whether I'd had undue influence over their father in his final years. I looked at her. Undue influence, I repeated. It's a legal term, she said, leaning forward slightly. It comes up in contested wills. When an elderly man changes his will late in life, the court examines whether someone around him may have. Diane, I said, your father changed his will because the two of you stole $230,000 from his investment account over 7 years. He documented it. He told me in a letter. The bank records will confirm it. Randall stood up. That is a serious accusation, and you have no— Sit down, Randall, I said. My voice was quiet. He sat down. Diane's composure cracked. Not completely, but enough. Her jaw tightened. If you go forward with this, she said, we will counterclaim. We will tie this up for years. You're 74, Eleanor. Do you really want to spend whatever time you have left? Yes, I said simply. I do. They left. Not as they'd arrived. Purposeful, unified, sure of themselves. They left with something shaken in them, something they hadn't expected to find when they walked through that door. After they were gone, I sat in George's chair for a long time. The house was very quiet. I thought about what Diane had said, the depositions, the counterclaim, the years it might take. She hadn't been inventing those possibilities. They were real, and the thought of them was exhausting in a bone-deep way that I couldn't quite dismiss. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days where I didn't check my email, didn't call Catherine, didn't read anything related to the case. I went to Barbara's house one afternoon, and we sat on her porch and talked about nothing important. Her daughter's new job, the price of tomato seedlings, a novel we'd both half read. I walked in the neighborhood every morning. I ate properly. I slept more than I had in weeks. On the 4th day, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and called Catherine. I'm ready, I said. Whatever comes next. The offer came through an intermediary. Not directly through Diane or Randall, which told me they'd been advised by someone, a lawyer, I assumed, or perhaps just common sense arriving late, to keep a careful distance. The intermediary was Randall's wife, a woman named Pam, whom I had always considered basically harmless, the kind of person who organized her life around smoothing things over and calling it peacekeeping. Pam called me on a Sunday morning and asked if she could come by. I said yes, because I was curious to hear what they'd decided to offer. She arrived with a small potted plant, a gesture so obviously coached it was almost touching, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. She said the family had been doing a lot of reflection. She said Diane and Randall understood that feelings had been hurt and that perhaps things could have been handled differently from the start. She said, and here she opened a small piece of paper she'd been holding folded in her hand, that they were prepared to offer me a private settlement of $45,000, no court involvement, everything handled quietly, in exchange for withdrawing the petition. I poured us both more coffee while she talked. I waited until she finished. Then I said, Pam, what did they originally take from the account? She blinked. I don't know the details. $230,000, I said, plus whatever my correct share of the estate would be under the revised will, which includes this house outright and a separate savings account. They are offering me $45,000 to make all of that disappear. Pam was quiet. You seem like a decent person, I said, and I meant it without cruelty. I think you were put in an uncomfortable position this morning, and I don't hold that against you. But please tell them no. She left with the potted plant because I didn't want it. The interesting thing about that offer was what it confirmed. They were nervous. If they had been fully confident in their legal position, if they'd truly believed the old will was airtight and the bank records were irrelevant, they would not have sent Pam with $45,000 and a small fern. Nervous people overplay or underplay, and Diane had underplayed, which meant she was more frightened than she appeared. What did they actually believe I was capable of? I wondered that often during those weeks. I suspected the answer was not much. I was a 74-year-old woman who had spent her career in a library and her adult life in a garden. I had no legal background, no history of conflict, no particular reputation for persistence. I imagine I had seemed, from their vantage point, like someone who could be managed. Informed of the outcome, perhaps made to feel briefly bad about it, and then guided gently toward acceptance. They had not accounted for what George's letter would do to me. There is a particular kind of anger that is very cold and very clean, not the hot anger that makes you say things you regret, but the steady kind that simply reorganizes your priorities and makes you very clear about what matters. That was what I felt. I was not raging. I was certain. During this period, I found that I was not as alone as I might have feared. Barbara had been the beginning, but she was not the end. Word had traveled, carefully, selectively, the way it does in a community of women of a certain age. And I had quietly received the support of several people I hadn't expected. My neighbor on the east side, Helen Pruitt, was the widow of a man who had been a county court clerk for 30 years. She invited me to lunch one afternoon and told me, over chicken soup, that she knew the probate court's procedures well and that she'd be happy to help me understand any filings I found confusing. I accepted immediately. My former colleague from the library, a woman named Ruth Adeyemi, who had since become the branch manager, called to check in and said that her nephew was a financial forensic accountant. She said she'd mentioned my situation to him in general terms, no names, and that he'd confirmed that the type of withdrawals I'd described left very clear paper trails that were difficult to contest. And my doctor, at a routine appointment, noticed that I seemed unusually stressed and asked after me. When I told her, in abbreviated terms, what I was dealing with, she nodded and wrote down the name of a therapist who specialized in late-life family conflict. "Not because anything is wrong with you," she said firmly, "because you're dealing with something hard and everyone needs support." I went twice. It helped. By the time Diane and Randall's silence stretched into its third week, they had stopped reaching out, stopped sending intermediaries, seemingly content to let the legal process play out while they recalibrated. I was no longer afraid of the silence. I had filled it with people who were on my side. I had filled it with purpose. The bank records arrived at Catherine's office on a Thursday. She called me that afternoon, and though she was professionally careful with her words, I could hear the satisfaction underneath them. "The records are comprehensive," she said, "and they match." They came on a Saturday morning in early May, when the dogwood in the front yard was in full bloom, a detail I remember because it seemed wrong somehow that things could be so pretty while so much ugliness was in motion. This time they called ahead, which was new. Diane's voice on the phone was different from the last time. Softer, without the tight control. "We'd like to come and talk, Eleanor," she said. "Just talk. No lawyers, no filings. We miss you. You were part of our family for 40 years. I almost said no, but I thought, let them speak. You can learn from what people say when they think they're winning you over. I said yes. I set out coffee and the good cups. They arrived looking subdued. Randall had made an effort with his appearance. A pressed shirt, his hair combed. Diane had left her managing manner at home and come as something that approximated vulnerability. She hugged me at the door, which she hadn't done in years, and said she was sorry for how the last visit had gone. Randall nodded, earnestly, in the way that men nod when they've been coached. We sat in the living room again. The first 20 minutes were warm, almost pleasant. They asked about the garden. They mentioned a memory of George. Diane said she'd found a photograph of us all at Thanksgiving 12 years ago, and it had made her cry. I listened. I nodded. I waited. Then the turn came. It began with Randall, which surprised me. He was usually the follower. "Eleanor," he said, "we want you to think about what this case is actually doing, not just to us. To you." Diane leaned in, picking up the thread with practiced smoothness. The process, she said, was going to be brutal. Depositions, financial scrutiny, a judge examining the most private corners of our marriage. And for what? "Dad is gone," she said, and her voice caught. Genuinely, I thought, or close enough to genuine to be indistinguishable. "He's gone, and whatever he thought he was doing with that letter, whatever state of mind he was in at the end, he was in full possession of his mind," I said. "He was an old man in declining health," she said. "Lawyers will argue that. They will call Philip Greer and they will ask him whether Dad seemed confused, whether he asked the same questions twice, whether there were any—" "Diane," I said, "stop." She stopped. "I know what you're doing," I said. I kept my voice very level. "You're trying to convince me that pursuing this case will be so painful that it isn't worth it. You're suggesting that a judge might decide your father wasn't competent when he made the new will. You're implying that I influenced him." I looked at her steadily. "You came here to frighten me, and you want me to confuse the fear with a reason to give up." Randall started to speak. I held up my hand and he stopped, which seemed to surprise him. "I'm not going to give up," I said. "I want to be very clear about that. Not because I'm angry, though I am, but because your father specifically asked me, in writing, to know the truth. He trusted me with it, and I'm not going to betray that trust to make your situation easier." Diane's softness left her face. What replaced it was the expression I'd always known was underneath. Flat, calculating, old. "You think you're going to win this," she said. "I think the evidence is very clear," I said, "and I think you know it. We will make this as difficult as possible." Her voice had dropped, and there was something in it that was meant to frighten me. Not a threat exactly, but the promise of a threat. "Every document, every deposition, every filing. You will be exhausted before this is over." "Perhaps," I said, "but I'll be on the right side of it." They left without saying goodbye. The front door closed, not slammed, which would have been undignified, but closed with a firmness that was its own kind of statement. I stood in the living room, and I felt something cold move through me. A real fear, not the managed kind. The recognition that they had meant what they said, that they had the resources to make the process long and grinding, that exhaustion was a genuine weapon in their hands. I was 74. I was not going to pretend that didn't matter. But then I thought about George's handwriting. For Eleanor. "Open this and you will know the truth about our family." He had left me that letter because he believed I was capable of doing something with it. He had trusted me with the most important truth of his final years. He had seen something in me that his children apparently had not. The fear didn't leave, but it moved to one side and made room for something steadier. I went into the kitchen and called Catherine. "They've escalated," I told her. "Good," she said, and I could hear what she meant by it. Escalation meant they were afraid people made mistakes. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in June, in a courtroom on the third floor of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. A room with high ceilings and fluorescent light and the particular institutional smell of carpet that has absorbed decades of anxiety. Catherine had prepared me thoroughly. We'd spent 3 sessions going over what I would be asked, how I should answer, where the critical evidence would be introduced. "You will be calm," she'd said, in the way that made it a statement rather than a request. "You know this material better than they expect you to. Let that do the work." I wore the blue dress I'd bought for George's retirement dinner 12 years ago. It fit differently than it had then, but I liked what it represented. A moment when things were good, when I was standing next to him, and the future felt ordinary and long. Diane and Randall arrived with their attorney, a man named Gerald Stokes, who had a high-priced manner and the kind of confidence that comes from usually being in the stronger position. He assessed me across the courtroom with a brief professional glance and seemed to categorize me quickly. I noted that he seemed comfortable. Comfort was sometimes a liability. The morning began with procedural matters: Catherine's petition, the submission of Philip Greer's copy of the revised will, the authentication of George's handwriting by a forensic document examiner who had compared it against 12 years of signed correspondence. Stokes objected to various things in the methodical way of a lawyer who is buying time while recalibrating. Then came the bank records. Catherine presented them chronologically, walking the judge through 7 years of transfers from the joint investment account to 2 private accounts, one in Diane's name, one in Randall's, with clean, annotated charts that Ruth's nephew had helped prepare. The numbers were unambiguous. The dates were unambiguous. The accumulation of $231,412 was unambiguous. Stokes's response was that the transfers had been authorized by George, that George had been aware of them, that they represented an informal arrangement between a father and his children that was well within the norms of family financial management. The judge asked whether there was any written documentation of this authorization. There was not. The judge asked whether there were any communications, emails, letters, text messages, in which George expressed awareness of and consent to the transfers. There were not. Then Catherine called Diane to the stand. I watched Diane walk to the witness stand, and I thought, she is very good at this. She is composed and credible-looking, and she has done this in her head many times. And for the first several minutes of questioning, she was. She answered calmly. She said her father had been aware of the transfers. She said he had told her, verbally, on multiple occasions, that he considered the money an early distribution of her portion of the estate. She said she had documentation. "What documentation?" Catherine asked. Diane referenced 3 emails. Catherine produced the emails. She asked Diane to read the relevant portion of the first one aloud. Diane read it. It was from 7 years ago, a brief exchange about a family vacation, in which George had written, "Happy to help with the trip costs, we'll sort out the details later." There was no mention of the investment account. There was no mention of a distribution. "Is this the documentation you were referring to?" Catherine asked. "It's part of the context," Diane said. "The context of a vacation expense discussion, of an ongoing understanding between my father and me." Catherine moved to the second email. Similar pattern, a reference to George expressing general goodwill and flexibility with finances. Nothing approaching a specific authorization of structured transfers totaling $231,000. By the third email, Diane's composure had developed a hairline fracture. She was answering more slowly, choosing words with more care, which paradoxically made her sound less certain. Then Catherine asked, "Ms. Hargrove, when did you first learn of the existence of the revised will drafted by Philip Greer?" A pause. "I don't recall exactly. Did your father ever tell you he had revised his will?" "He may have mentioned." "Did he tell you, specifically?" That he had signed a new will in Philip Greer's office 14 months before his death? Another pause. I don't recall a specific conversation. Mr. Greer's records indicate that you called his office 2 weeks after your father's initial consultation about the revised will. Would you like to explain the nature of that call? The fracture widened. I may have called about. I was helping Dad with various administrative matters at the time. The call lasted 11 minutes. Mr. Greer's assistant noted that you asked specifically whether a new will had been signed and when. Diane said nothing. For the first time in the 40 years I had known her, she had nothing to say. Randall, called afterward, contradicted Diane on 2 material points: the timeline of when they'd learned about the revised will, and the nature of a conversation he'd allegedly had with George about the investment account. He did not do it obviously or dramatically. He did it in the ordinary way that happens when 2 people have coordinated a story but are interrogated separately and find that memory and nerves introduce small divergences that, in a courtroom, are not small at all. I sat beside Catherine, and I watched it happen. I watched the judge's face, which was careful and neutral in the professional way of judges, but whose attention had shifted and sharpened in a way that told me something. This is the truth, I thought. Whatever happens next, the truth has been in this room today. When I was called to give my own account, I was calm. I described finding the letter. I described George's handwriting, his careful precision with facts, his characteristic way of noting dates. I described the envelope tucked behind the safe. I described Diane telling me the safe had held nothing of value. The judge thanked me. I returned to my seat. Diane and Randall sat at their table looking at nothing in particular. Stokes was writing on a legal pad with the focused air of a man revising his expectations. Outside, through the 3rd-floor window, I could see a slice of Columbus in June. Green, ordinary, indifferent. Life going on without drama, the way it does. I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. The judge's written ruling arrived 3 weeks later. I had not slept particularly well during those 3 weeks. I had functioned, tended the garden, cooked meals, met Barbara for coffee twice, attended one of Ruth's library fundraising committee meetings where I sat in the back and let the ordinary business of the world flow around me. But beneath the surface rhythm of days was a steady undercurrent of waiting that I could not quiet. Catherine had told me she was confident. I believed her confidence was professionally grounded and not merely reassuring. But there is a distance between what a lawyer believes and what a person in her own kitchen at 2 a.m. can feel certain of, and I lived inside that distance for 21 days. When Catherine called on a Thursday afternoon, I was in the garden. I came inside, sat at the kitchen table, and listened. The court found that the revised will executed by George Edward Hart on September 14th, 14 months prior to his death, was valid in all respects. The testator had been of sound mind at the time of execution. A finding supported by Philip Greer's testimony, the witness statements from 2 individuals present at the signing, and the complete absence of any credible medical evidence suggesting diminished capacity. The document had been properly witnessed and notarized. The copy held by Philip Greer was legally sufficient to establish the will's existence and contents, and its authenticity had been confirmed by the forensic handwriting examination entered into evidence. The court further found that the submission of the prior will to probate, given the documented evidence that both Diane Hargrove and Randall Hart had been aware of the existence of a later will, as established by the phone call to Greer's office, the timing of the probate filing, and the material inconsistencies in their testimony, constituted fraudulent concealment. The court's language on this point was unambiguous in a way I had not expected. Judge Owens did not soften it with qualifications. She called it what it was. The original estate proceedings were vacated. The estate of George Edward Hart would be re-administered under the terms of the September 14th will. Under those terms, the house on Clover Ridge Road was mine, outright and without encumbrance. The savings account George had designated, $68,000 that Diane and Randall had not known existed, held in a separate institution under the estate, was mine. A small life insurance distribution went to Diane and Randall, as George had specified in the revised document. It was considerably less than they had received under the fraudulently filed prior will. The court ordered the return of those funds. And then there was the matter of the investment account. The court referred the financial records to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal liability. Catherine explained this carefully. It did not mean charges had been automatically filed, only that the matter was now in the hands of people whose specific job it was to determine whether what Diane and Randall had done crossed from civil fraud into criminal territory. Given the amounts, given the 7-year pattern, given the documented concealment of the will, she believed the referral was more than procedural. What does this mean for them practically? I asked. It means they will each need criminal defense attorneys, Catherine said, in addition to whatever they have already spent on Gerald Stokes, and separately from the civil claim for the $231,000, which we will be filing within the month. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was very green in the late afternoon light. The roses I had neglected in the weeks after George's death and slowly brought back through the spring were in bloom along the back fence. Ordinary, sturdy, returning because that is what roses do when someone tends them. "Are you all right?" Catherine asked. "Yes," I said. And I was not in a triumphant way. Not in the way I'd imagined when I was still afraid and picturing what winning might feel like. I was all right in a quieter way. The way you feel when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally corrected, and the correction does not bring the person back, and you did not expect it to, but it honors them. It gives their truth a place to stand. The civil claim was filed the following month. Diane and Randall contested it, because of course they did. They had no realistic alternative at that point, and people who have committed themselves to a position rarely abandon it cleanly, even when the ground beneath it has entirely gone. But the bank records were the bank records, and their defense had been substantially hollowed out by their own contradictory testimony. 18 months after Catherine's initial petition, they agreed to a settlement. $218,000 returned to the estate, the shortfall explained by what their respective legal teams had cost them, which was itself a form of justice I had not anticipated, but did not mourn. Stokes, I imagined, had billed extensively and without apology. Diane sent me one communication after the settlement was finalized. A single text message that read, "I hope you're satisfied." I read it once, set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went outside to water the roses. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. The truth had already said everything that needed to be said in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas on a Tuesday in June, while the city went about its ordinary business outside the window, and George Edward Hart's revised will was finally, properly honored. The summer after the settlement was the best summer I could remember in many years, which surprised me, because I had expected to feel George's absence more acutely once the distraction of the case was gone. Instead, I felt a kind of spaciousness that I hadn't known I was missing. I repainted the study, not to erase George, but to make it into something that was mine as well as his. I chose a soft sage green that looked good in the afternoon light. I moved his desk to face the window instead of the wall, which is where I'd always thought it should be. I kept his books on the shelves and added my own. I used a portion of the recovered money to do something I had mentioned to George more than once and never acted on. I traveled. Barbara and I went to New England in the fall, renting a small cottage in Vermont for 2 weeks. We drove along roads lined with maple trees that had turned improbable colors, and we ate dinner at places that had no dress code, and we talked for hours in the evenings, the way you can when you are old and have survived enough to have something to say. I took a train to see a college friend in Philadelphia. I flew, for the first time in 11 years, to visit my nephew and his family in Oregon. I also, quietly, established a small fund at the Columbus Public Library, not large, but meaningful, in George's name, to support literacy programs for adults. Ruth helped me set it up. There was a small plaque. I don't know if George would have wanted a plaque, but I thought he deserved one. I was not without sorrow. There were mornings when the house was very quiet, and his absence was a specific weight in the room. There were moments, a piece of music, a particular quality of evening light, the smell of coffee on a cold morning. When grief arrived without warning and was as sharp as it had ever been. I did not expect the happiness to cancel the grief. I had learned by then that they can coexist, and that coexistence is not the same as contradiction. Diane and Randall's situations, I learned from various sources over the following years, had deteriorated in ways that were the direct result of their own choices. The prosecutor's office did pursue the matter. Randall, whose financial situation had been more precarious than his sister's, and whose accounting in the deposition had been more significantly inconsistent, was charged with estate fraud, a felony in Ohio. He negotiated a plea agreement that avoided prison time but resulted in probation, mandatory financial restitution, and a permanent record that cost him a professional license he'd held for 20 years. His marriage to Pam did not survive it. He moved to a smaller apartment on the east side of Columbus and, as far as I knew, was working in a position considerably below what he'd previously held. Diane was not charged criminally. Her attorney managed the evidentiary questions more deftly. But the civil judgment against her, combined with the attorney's fees she'd accumulated, had severely damaged her finances. Her second marriage, which had been to a man with considerable money of his own, ended in the year following the settlement, for reasons I couldn't know but could speculate about. She remained in Columbus, in a house that was considerably smaller than the one she'd lived in before. I did not take satisfaction in their difficulties in any active way. I want to be clear about that. I did not follow their situations eagerly or feel pleasure when I heard bad news. They were the children of the man I had loved for 43 years, and that fact was not nothing. But I also did not pretend that their circumstances were unrelated to their choices. They had built something on a lie, built it carefully, over years, with deliberate effort. And when the lie was removed, what they had built came down. That was not punishment. That was the natural weight of consequence. The house on Clover Ridge Road was beautiful in the spring. The roses I'd tended for 30 years came back, as they always did, and the porch creaked in the right way. And on good mornings, I would sit out there with coffee and watch the neighborhood begin its day and feel something I could only describe as earned peace. Is it possible to grieve someone and also feel grateful for what they left you? I think it is. George left me the letter. He left me the truth. He left me, in his careful and indirect and flawed way, the means of protecting what we had built together. And I had honored that. That was enough. That was more than enough. George kept a secret from me for 43 years. Not to deceive me, but because he was a man who struggled with confrontation and who hoped, until he couldn't anymore, that things would resolve themselves. In the end, he found his way to trust me with the truth. What I learned is this: peace is not the same as passivity. Trusting your instincts, that tight feeling in your stomach when something is wrong, is not paranoia. And it is never too late, at any age, to stand up for what is right, and to refuse to let people who underestimate you define what you are capable of. What would you have done with that letter? I often wonder if I would have been brave enough, 10 years younger, 5 years younger. I'd like to think the answer would always have been yes. I hope you'd say the same. If this story moved you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in my place. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe. Thank you so much for spending this time with Eleanor Hart.